Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Dalet. We have a very interesting daf which gets at really a lot of the issues that I know people were trying to figure out. How do we know if we can rely on people? Which kind of people are reliable? We're going to talk about groups like the Cutim, who are kind of have rules as a group, and then we're going to talk about individuals based on their actions. Can we trust them or not, and on what basis? So we're going to start with, let's just remember, we started with Hakol Shochatim Shechitatan Kshera, which was a sentence that gave us a lot of trouble. We had 6 different interpretations. We're going to focus right now on the 2 that Abaye and Rava, who both talk about the Cutim, even though in the end of the daf we learned that it's possible that Rava really was just talking within Abaye and modifying Abaye, but we still have these 2 interpretations, whether in order for it to be ideally kosher, it has to be that the Jew is there the whole time, or it's enough that the Jew is standing there just for part of the time, right? Going in and out like the way we know mashgichim do. Mashgichei kashrut. So we're going to bring a braita, and from that braita, we're going to show that one line of this braita seems to support Abaye, while the other line seems to support Rava, and then we're going to have to say, how does each one read it according to their interpretation, the line that seems to support the other side. Tanu Rabbanan, 3 lines from the bottom of Gimel Amud Bet. Shechitat Cuti muteret. The shechita of a Cuti is permitted. Bamed dvarim amurim. In which case is this? Kashi Yisrael omed al gabav. That already looks like Abaye, because when there's a Jew standing there, it sounds like the whole time. Aval ba'u mitza'o shachat. Now on the other extreme, we have one extreme which is it's accepted when someone's there the whole time. The other extreme, and this one's going to prove Rava more, which is if you came in and found that it was already slaughtered, so you walk into a room, you weren't there before, you walk into the room, you see it was already slaughtered, so you cut off a piece, right, an olive bulk of meat, you give it. Why an olive bulk, by the way? Because if someone eats less than an olive bulk, they actually won't transgress, right? You won't be punished anyway, because it's not a full shiur. So if it was less than the kazayit and the kuti ate it, that might not be enough of an indicator. So we would have to eat an amount that's forbidden to then say, oh, I guess it's permitted, otherwise there's no way the kuti would have eaten it. So chotet kazayit v'notenlo, you give it to the kuti to eat. Achalo mutar lecho meshchita tov. If the kuti eats it, then you know you can rely on it. Now this line seems to prove Rava. We'll read this inside, but I'll tell you already now, because only if you walked in and found it already slaughtered. What's the stage before that? Or if you're not going to go from extreme to extreme, in that case, the kuti has to taste it. Otherwise, you can rely on it. What would otherwise be? If you were in and out, as long as you were kind of in and out, that would be sufficient. It's not the most strongest proof, but it is a positive. That's going to be the way to read it according to Rava. Kayotsebo. Another similar case, and this case actually we're going to get off on a tangent about it since we quoted the braita. This really isn't relevant for our purposes anymore, but it's a parallel case, although not completely parallel, which is why we're going to discuss it. Kayotsebo, just like this, matzabi yado dekuria shel tziporim. If you found a string where on it we had lots of birds hanging on the string, that's the way, if you remember in Bava Metzia, Elu Metziot, there's one of the things you find that doesn't have a siman is a machrozet shel dagim. That's how they would sell things. They would hang a string and hang fish on it. So, right, like imagine in the shuk, in a marketplace. So there was a string of birds. Now this is already different from the previous case, because what's going to happen here? Kotea rosho shel echad mehem v'noten lo. So you have a string of birds that he slaughtered. So you have him cut off the head of one of them and have him eat it. Achalo, if he eats it, mutar lechom shchitato, then you can eat from the birds, all the birds. Now this is different. Before, there was one animal that was slaughtered. You cut off a piece of it. If he eats that, right, obviously the rest of it is kosher. Here, we're going to rely on the fact that if one bird was kosher, they must all be kosher. Okay, we're going to have to talk about that soon, why we can rely on that. V'im lav, and if the kuti won't eat it, asur lechom shchitato, you can't eat from these birds. So back to why we brought this, forget the birds for right now. Abaye diek mi reisha, Rava diek mi seifa. So Abaye derived his opinion from the first sentence, Rava from the end, but it doesn't mean the end, it means the end of the second sentence, the end of the first case. So let's read it. Abaye diek mi reisha, how did he get it? Tama di Yisrael omed al gabav. Because why? The Jew was standing there. It sounds like the Jew was standing there the whole time. Aval yotzev v'nichnas lo. But if the Jew was coming in and out, sounds like that wouldn't work. Rava diek miseifa. Tama, the reason why you have to make the Cuti eat it, and if the Cuti won't eat it, you can't eat it. Tama, because you got there only at the end, after it was already slaughtered. But anything better than that, like coming in and out, would have been sufficient. So now that we proved how each one learns it, we're now going to have to say, well, how does each one read the other line that doesn't prove their point? L'Abaye kashya seifa. So L'Abaye, the second line, is problematic. Amar lach yotzev nichnas nami ba'u mitzao karele. What does it mean, ba'u mitzao? You came and found that it was already slaughtered. What does that mean then? You're obviously going in and out. And the going in and out didn't help you. And therefore, right, what do you see here? Going in and out is not sufficient. You have to be there for the whole time. And that's why in this case, you came in, and when you came in, right, it happened to be the moment the mashgiach came in, it was too late, it was already done. But that could be describing a situation where you were coming and going, it just happened to be you missed the entire slaughter. And that's why Abaye would say, it doesn't really work, this coming and going. Ula Rava kashya reisha, or not, that's not why also, but it's, right, that shows that this doesn't work, coming in and out. Ula Rava kashya reisha, what's he going to do with the line that says the Jew is standing there? So Amar Lach, he could say, Yotzev nichnas nami ka'omer agabav dami. What does it mean standing there watching? It means standing there watching part of the time. The Jew was going in and out, right? Could be, even the words standing there watching could even mean while standing and watching some of the time. Okay, so we have the braita. We then showed how Abaye and Rava each read the line that supports their opinion, and that's why we brought it, to show each one has support for their opinion in braita, but then how do they each respond to the other? And by the way, they weren't there to respond, but the Gemara responds for them. Now we want to get to this case of the birds and talk about how it's different and raise some problems with this case. Like, why really are we relying on the Cuti? And from this, we're going to get to some questions I know were asked yesterday, like, how can we rely on the fact that the Cuti knows shehiyah, chalada, all those psulim, and right? Why are we relying on Cutim in this area? So kayotze, we're now just quoting the line in the braita. Matzabi yado dekuria shel tzipolin, kotea rosho v'chulei. Amai lechush dilma haihu dahavashaka shapir. Well, the first slew of questions is going to be, why aren't we worried that the Cuti is tricking us? Maybe the Cuti is going to eat that one bird, but maybe the others weren't slaughtered properly. Okay? Could be, right, that specifically that one is the kosher one. Doesn't mean the rest are. We have a string of birds. They were all slaughtered at different slaughterings. You can't slaughter all the birds at the same time in the same way. So the fact that he'll eat one doesn't necessarily mean that the person slaughtered all of them in the proper manner. Amar Rav Menashe, here's an interesting siman. The siman to remember this is machnis izmil b'zcharim. Okay, zcharim are male rams. Okay, but anyway, and an Ismail is like a scalpel kind of thing. This is a very strange siman for the following reason. We often have these siman, even the Gemara, we usually don't pay too much attention to them. They're ways to remember mnemonics, to remember what the upcoming sugyas are, or who the rabbis who spoke, or all sorts of things like that. What's weird about this siman is for 3 statements Rav Menashe is going to make, but in all of Masechet Chullin. And the other 2 don't come up anywhere near this sugya. So we're only going to see the machnis one. The other 2 we'll see later in the Masechet. Hopefully when we get there, we'll remember. B'machnisan tachat knafav. Okay, what does he say? He says, what's going on here? I see this machrozet I see this string full of decoria of tzipolim. So I want to know if I can eat it. So what do? I don't trust the Cuti if the Cuti is going to eat one piece, maybe it's the one that was kosher and not the others, right? One head of one of the birds. So what do? I put it under my cloak. I hide them. And then I pull one out, right? It sounds like a magician. I pull one out randomly so that the Cuti can't tell which one I'm pulling out. And if they're willing to eat that one, then I'm good. Okay? And then I know this was random. So if it was a random one the Cuti ate, then that will protect me. Okay? Then I know it's kosher. Maybe the birds had markers on them, notations, and the Cuti knew which one was kosher, which wasn't. And maybe the one I took out happened to have a siman, and if I pulled out one that didn't, that had a siman of the non-kosher one, so the Cuti wouldn't have eaten it. But if I pull out the one with the kosher, the Cuti eats it. So the fact that the Cuti takes the one I took out randomly, who knows, maybe there are some sort of notation on it that told the Cuti which one it is, and maybe only that one's kosher. So I must have smushed them. Okay, I took them under my cloak. I smushed them up a little so that you can't, if there was a siman that's no longer there, there was no identifying marker, I pull out a random one. If the Cuti eats it, we can assume that they're all kosher. Okay, that's problem number one, that we were sorted. Okay, we're not worried about the Cuti tricking us by eating one that's kosher and then the others aren't. No, we assume if it's a random sampling, which has no sign on it whatsoever, we can assume it's fine. Now we're going to say, second problem. Now the Cutim, first of all, one of the things we know about the Cutim is that they very much were strict about keeping what was said explicitly in the Torah. But it never says explicitly in the Torah that you need to slaughter birds. It only says you need to slaughter animals. So maybe they don't hold that slaughtering of birds is from the Torah. And therefore, maybe the Cuti will eat the bird because the Cuti thinks doesn't need a proper slaughtering. To which they say, V'litamech, well, according to that then, let's go back to the animal. And this is a question some people asked yesterday. Shihia, drasa, chalada, hagrama, v'ikor, miktivan. All those 5 psulim that we obviously rely on them, that they didn't slaughter the animal in a way where they waited or they put the knife under or all those different 5 issues, they're not written in the Torah, and yet we rely on the Cutim to do a kosher shechita. So if we rely on them to do a kosher shechita, then we should rely on them that they slaughter birds. Neither is written explicitly in the Torah. Ela kevan de'achziku behu, achziku behu. Hachanami kevan de'achziku, achziku. Why do we hold by their shechita when there's, of course, shechita needs to be from the Torah, but how do we know they know all the details? Because even though in general they keep things by Torah law and not necessarily by rabbinic law, there are certain things in rabbinic law that they kept, I would say, religiously, okay? That they were known as a group. This is why it's interesting, because later we're going to talk about an individual. As a group, they were known to have accepted upon themselves certain things that weren't explicit in the Torah. So we're going to say like this. The reason why we rely on them with shehiyah, drisa, and all those is because there's a tradition that they accepted it upon themselves. That's what we call a chazaka. There's a chazaka that we can rely on them, that they do it. So we can say the same thing about the birds. That must be why we rely on their birds, even though there's no shechita for birds from the Torah explicitly. We can assume that this is something they took upon themselves, and that's why the braita said that we rely on it. In other words, from the fact that the braita allows it, shows that we can rely on them to do this. Okay, that it shows that they must have been accustomed to doing this. So now we talked about, let's just clarify, because now we're going to start mixing this up a little. Things written in the Torah, we believe them, right? They're trusted about, and things not written in the Torah, but they have a chazaka, meaning we know that they, as a group, accepted it. We can rely on any random Cuti, assuming that random Cuti accepted it like the rest of their people. Okay, now we're going to point out though that what we just explained is actually a Tannaitic debate. Okay, the ichzuk velo ichzuk b'delo k'tivei Tannai. It's a bit of a strange language, and Rashi even says, I'll explain to you what this ichzuk velo ichzuk means because it doesn't make much sense. What it really means is ichzuk b'delo k'tivei. Okay, even though it says ichzuk velo ichzuk, if there's a chazaka on something that's not written explicitly in the Torah, which is like we just talked about, shia drisa, or shechita of a bird. Now the velo ichzuk word means whether or not we accept the chazaka as then we can rely on them, is a Tannaitic debate. So even though a minute ago we said if it's not written in the Torah, but they've accepted it upon themselves as a group, we can rely on them, that's a subject of debate. And now we're going to see. But it's going to take us a little while to see how it's a subject of debate. So only at the very end of this section are we going to pinpoint the Tannaitic debate that we're discussing. So we can forget about this momentarily, although keep in the back of your mind that what we're trying to find out is that when you have something not written in the Torah, but the Cutim accepted it as a group, is that sufficient enough or not? We're going to see ultimately that's a Tannaitic debate. But we're going to start with the topic that's actually written in the Torah, which is matzah, eating matzah on Pesach and not having chametz on Pesach. So Ditanya, matzat kuti muteret, va'adam yotzei bo yedei chavato b'Pesach. We're going to have a braita with 3 opinions here. So a matzah of a kuti is permitted, and you can use it to rely on it on the first night of Pesach to fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah. Rabbi Elazar osel. Rabbi Elazar forbids. Okay, there's a debate. What does he forbid? Does he forbid the second part, using it for Leila Seder? Most people say that wouldn't be forbids. You wouldn't use that language. What he forbids is their matzah. He doesn't trust the kashrus of their matzah. He thinks it could be chametz. Lefisha ein bekim b'tiktukei mitzvot Yisrael, because they're not careful about the details of the mitzvah. We all know halacha is incredibly detail-oriented. And they might eat matzah, but their matzah is not the kind of matzah that we eat. They're not careful about the halachot. So they have completely opposite opinions. One says it's so kosher you could even fulfill your obligation of matzah on the first night of Pesach. And the second opinion says completely not. Now the third opinion is going to be a little confusing because it's not really clear how he disagrees with Tannaitic. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, kol mitzvah shechaziku ba Cutim, harbe medaktakim ba yoter miYisrael. Now he's clearly saying something a little different, but in the end the bottom line would be the same here. Any mitzvah that the Cutim accepted upon themselves, they're actually more careful about it than the Jews. Okay? This is an interesting statement. What it means and why this is a good question. I don't have a good answer for that. But basically, he says these Cutim, when they take upon themselves something, they take it upon themselves all the way. And they're very careful about all the details about it. Okay, but again, it's not clear how he exactly disagrees. We're going to get back to it. Right now, we're going to start back at the beginning of the braita and go line by line and raise some questions, which are not necessarily connected to our topic directly. Matzat amar, matzat kuti muteret. V'adam yotzei bo yedei chavato b'Pesach. Pshita. So now they say, okay, the second line is an obvious corollary of the first. If their matzah is kosher, then of course you could use it for the first night. What's the chiddush here? Why are we telling also that you can use it for Pesach, for Seder night? Ma'u detema lo b'kiyeh b'shimor kamash malan. The night of Pesach, your matzah has to be watched l'shem, exactly, gita, l'shem mitzvah. There's a special, the regular matzah you eat during the week doesn't have to be watched for the sake of the mitzvah of eating matzah, but the ones you eat on Leila Seder, that's why people have also hamich, more matzah, all different things there, but basically it has to be watched specifically for the sake of the mitzvah. So you might have thought that they're not careful about that, right? So you might have thought, Ma'u detema lo b'kiyeh b'shimor. Maybe they're not careful about that and don't do it. Kamash malan, it's to tell you not only is there no chametz in there, but also they also are very careful to watch it for the sake of the mitzvah. Rabbi Elazar Osil. Now we're going to move to him. Lefisha ein b'kiyeh b'diktukei mitzvot. Kasavar. What are they not careful about? Lo b'kiyeh b'shimor. In other words, they do keep Torah mitzvot. They keep matzah, but they're not careful about shimor. Now here depends. If you say, like I said before, that he won't let you use it for Leila Seder, but he does let you use it during the week, then we're talking about the same shimor as before. We don't think that they're careful about shimor l'shem mitzvah. But most of the commentaries think that he's talking about shimor from chametz. That they're not careful about the 18 minutes, and it might actually, maybe they do 20 minutes or 25, or they're not careful the way we are careful, and therefore you can't eat their matzah at all. Okay, next. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now we're going to get back to our main point, but not yet. Almost there. Kol mitzvah shechziku ba Cutim harbe medaktakim ba yoter miYisrael. So the Gemara's question on him is very obvious. Hainu Tannaitic. Okay, they're basically both saying, well, the Cutim, Rabbi said you can eat their matzah, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says you can eat their matzah because they obviously accepted it upon themselves. So the first suggestion is not the one we're looking for. We're going to reject the first suggestion. Well, the second one is the one that's going to prove our point. Which is, the first suggestion is Ika benayu diktiva velo achzikuba. The machloket is in a case where it's written like matzah, but we don't have any proof or any knowledge that they've accepted this mitzvah upon themselves. And then we're going to take this as a general rule. When something's written in the Torah, but we don't know that the Cutim are careful about this, can we rely on it or not? And it's going to go like this. We're going to see who holds what. Tannaitic saval kevan diktiva afagav de lo achziku ba. Okay, the Tannaitic says, look, matzah's fine. What they mean to say is, why is matzah fine? We know matzah's fine because it's written in the Torah. Written in the Torah is sufficient. Once it's written in the Torah, we assume all the Cutim keep everything written explicitly in the Torah. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who basically, what was his emphasis? He said, anything shechziku ba, they're much more careful than the Jews are. So what's his point? Shimon Gamliel savar ichzuk in ilo ichzuk lo. Written in the Torah is not sufficient. Why do we rely on their matzah? Because we know that they accept it upon themselves. And once they accept it upon themselves, we can know that they really take it very seriously. But if not, if we have something written in the Torah, we don't have any sort of knowledge that they accepted it upon themselves, then we can't do it. So he's actually, what sounded like he was being more lenient about accepting the Cuti was actually being more stringent and saying, only when ichzuk, written is not enough. And that's because the language of what he used was all about ichzuk, about the chazaka. But the Gemara rejects this and says, that doesn't match the language though. It might match the fact that he was focusing on chazaka. But ihachi, kol mitzvah she'echziku ba Cutim, the language he says is any mitzvah that they ichziku ba. Now if you wanted to say, if it's written, but they didn't do a chazaka on it, right? There's no chazaka that we know of. We can't rely on them. Then it should have worded it like this: Im hirziku mibayle. It should have said, if the whole thing is premised on did they accept it or not, is there a chazaka or not? Then it should have said, if there's a chazaka, then we know then we can rely on them. Which would then imply, but if not, no. And that's not the language they use. He makes this general language which just says, oh, every time they are known to do this, we know for sure. But it should have worded it differently. It would have been much more clear. And what they're really getting at is, according to this, Rav Shimon Gamliel is more stringent, and that certainly doesn't seem to match the language. He seemed to be more inclusive, not more exclusive. So the second option is what we're finally looking for. Now, remember where we started. We wanted to talk about a case like shechita and like shechita loaf, which are not written explicitly in the Torah. And we wanted to say, since they've accepted it upon themselves, we know we can rely on them. So, and then we said, by the way, that whole thing is a machloket tanaim, and that's exactly what we're going to do. This case they're arguing about was matzah, which is written in the Torah. But the reason why Rav Shimon Gamliel focuses on the chazaka is because like this. We're going to read it now. Ela ika beinayu delo ktiva ve'ichziku ba. What he was trying to get at is, chazaka will help you in a case when there's nothing written, when it's not written in the Torah. Okay? And that's why he used that language. And here he's going to come out more lenient. So Tanakama saval, kevanta lo ktiva, falgav dichziku ba'nami lo. What does Tanakama say? Matzah is mutar. Why is matzah mutar? Because it's written. What if it wasn't written and there's a chazaka? Well, he doesn't talk about chazaka. So he doesn't rely on chazaka. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who says it's all about chazaka, right? Now, it's not all about chazaka, because if it's written, he would say we can rely on them without a chazaka. But if it's not written in the Torah, if they have a chazaka about it, that's fine too, even if it's not written in the Torah. And that seems to be the one we're relying upon in our sugya, to say we can rely on the Cutim when it comes to shechita, when it comes to shechita from a bird, okay, because we assume that again, there was a chazaka that the Cutim were doing that, and that's how we can rely on them. Okay, so here are different approaches about what makes us able to rely on a community of Cutim. Okay, what makes us rely on the individuals in that community? We go by what the community does, and then we have a little bit of a debate. Is it only things written explicitly in the Torah, or is it even things that we know that as a group they accepted it upon themselves historically, right? That's a historical kind of answer. Okay, and there we have a debate, whether we can rely on that or not, whether that's strong enough. Okay, now we're going to go into another very interesting topic, gufa. This is a gufa this means we're going back to something we saw yesterday. Amar Rava, Yisrael mumar ochel nevelot l'tevon. We have a Jew who doesn't keep, now, he's ochel nevelot l'tevon. Now, this is a general term which usually means someone who doesn't really keep halacha when it's inconvenient for them. Okay? Like cheaper food, whatever it might be. But notice the words. The words are ochel nevelot l'tevon. He eats meat that wasn't slaughtered. And yet, what does Rava say? Right? It's fascinating. This is someone who will go to a non-kosher restaurant and eat meat that wasn't slaughtered, right? Eat meat in a non-kosher restaurant, has no problem doing that. And yet, if we, right, according to Rava, bodek sakim v'noten lo, umutar lecho mishchitato. That same person who eats meat that wasn't slaughtered properly, I give him a knife, I check the knife, I say, slaughter this animal, or after I check the knife, the person slaughters the animal, whether for me or not for me, I can eat from their shechita. Now, that's a little bit strange. Now, this is what you call, right, there's mumar, we're going to talk about this topic a lot today. There's mumar l'davar achel. There's people who don't keep certain halachot, but we can rely on them for other halachot, which is kind of like we're talking about the Cutim. But this is mumar for this issue. Specifically, they don't care about whether the meat's shechted or not. And yet we rely on their shechita. It's a fascinating statement. Like, where does he get this from? So we talked about yesterday where he gets it from, my time. This comes up in many sugyot. It's about getting into the mindset of a person. If a person has an option in front of them, they can, in the same way, slaughter it kosher or slaughter it not kosher. They're going to just slaughter it kosher. Okay, as opposed to they're away on vacation, there's no restaurants. Either they don't eat or they go to a non-kosher restaurant, right? That's different. That's for convenience purposes. They're going to end up eating in the non-kosher restaurant. Not to say that's okay, right? But when you have these two options in front of you, like let's say you're on vacation, there's a kosher restaurant and a non-kosher restaurant. So that person, we're going to assume, would likely go to the kosher restaurant, assuming, let's say, the quality is reasonably similar, right? And it's not a disgusting restaurant, but we can assume they'll go to the kosher restaurant, because why would you go to the non-kosher if you go to the kosher restaurant? So it's likewise. The person's about to slaughter the animal. Why would he slaughter it not kosher if he could slaughter it kosher? It's just as easy. Ihachi kilo badak nami. So then they say, then why do I have to check the knife? Don't we assume if they're going to do it right, they're going to do it right, and they'll check the knife? Mitrach lo tarich. No, that's already an effort. They have to make an effort to do that. Okay? They have to check the knife, and if it has a nick, they have to fix the knife. That's already a big deal. So we assume things that are easy, they're going to do. Things that require effort, not. Now they're going to bring a braita to support this concept that lo shavik inish hetera, which means literally, a person won't leave heter the avidi surah and go do something forbidden. So here we have a different case. Chametzan, which means the chametz of ovrei avera achara pesach. We have people who don't really care about Pesach. They keep chametz in their house over Pesach. They don't sell it to a non-Jew, right, or get rid of it. They keep it in their house over Pesach. Now, chametz shavar lava Pesach, it's called. Chametz that we have, that we left over Pesach in our house, and we didn't sell, is forbidden to eat. It's also forbidden to benefit from after Pesach. We're going to see in a minute, there's a machloket whether it's Torah law or rabbinic law. Okay? Turning now to Amud Bet. Mutar miyad. If I have a neighbor who's like this and doesn't care about their chametz on Pesach, I can go there right after Pesach. Okay, we're going to see in a minute, not exactly right after, but very soon after, and borrow a box of pasta from them. Why? Mipnei shehem machlifin. Because we assume it's so easy. They can go to the other neighbor on the other side who's not Jewish, switch the boxes of pasta, okay, take my barilla pasta, switch it, their barilla pasta, switch it with the neighbor's barilla pasta, and say, okay, mine was problematic. Let me swap it with you. And then you can assume, now, what's the miyad then? The amount of time it would take them to find a non-Jewish person that they could swap with. Okay, now obviously if you're living in Ranana, it's not going to be so easy to find a non-Jew to go swap your food with. But here we're talking about Babylonia, where there were a lot of non-Jews and you're living near them. And obviously there's many places in the world, not where I live, but where there's a lot of non-Jews, and you can easily swap the food. So, mutar miyad shemipnei shem machlifim. So we assume since it's super easy to just swap, they'll rather choose, this is actually even making an effort, but it's such a minor effort that we can assume it was done. So I can go there and I can eat their pasta. Okay. So when they heard this, Savrua Hamane Rabbi Yehuda, they thought this was Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Damar chametz achar pesach doraita. It's by Torah law forbidden. And katane mipnei shem machlifin. So what do you learn here? This is a Torah law. And it says here, because they swap, meaning this proves exactly Rava. Alma lo shavakatera va'achali sur. So the rabbis brought this proof for Rava and suggested, here's a proof for your theory, right? Because they'd rather have permitted pasta than forbidden pasta. To which, there's a counter here. Mimai, why are you assuming that? Dilma Rabbi Shimon hi ta'amar chametz char pesach d'Rabbanan. Maybe it's because it's only d'Rabbanan. Now I could go to my neighbor who left their chametz over Pesach, and I can assume that they swapped it in order to allow me to go take a box of pasta from them. But that's just because we're being lenient, because the whole thing is only rabbinic, and in rabbinic law we're lenient, and this has nothing to do with shavik inish hetera v'achali surah. This is just, we're going to be lenient, and if I want to go get pasta from my neighbor who maybe left it over Pesach, I can assume, I can make a jump and say, well, listen, since it's only d'Rabbanan, I can assume they swapped it with their neighbor. But that's not what we were trying to say before. So now the Gemara is going to reject this second possibility and keep this source actually as a proof for Rava. V'tahavinami Rabbi Shimon. You can ask according to Rabbi Shimon, this doesn't really match Rabbi Shimon. Why? Mikatani, again, the language doesn't match him. Mikatani sha'ani omer hichlifu. What is Shani Omer? Shani Omer means I can make an assumption. If I'm going to go to my neighbor's house after Pesach and get some pasta, I can assume, right, because we can rely lakula, and I can make a jump and say, probably they changed it. But it doesn't say that. In other words, it should have said, Shani Omer machlifin. But mipnei machlifin katani. But it actually says, because they changed, they swap. Meaning, divadai machlifin. For sure they swap. That's what they're telling you in this source. The language of this is telling you, for sure they swap. And if in a drabanan they don't, they're going to leave the het, they're not going to leave a heter and do it the permitted way. Obviously in doraita they're going to do it. So even if you would say it's Rabbi Shimon, it would have to be based on lo shavik inish heter v'achali surah, that they definitely did it. And if you're going to say that in a rabbinic law, they're going to always pick the permitted way and not do a rabbinic prohibition. Of course they're not going to do a Torah prohibition. They're going to be much more careful about that. So either which way you explained it, it does prove the point of Rava. Okay. That was the first source to try to prove Rava. Now they're going to bring another one, but this one they're not going to be so successful with. Lema Meseale. We're going to bring a Tosefta now. Hakol shochatin v'afilu Cuti, afilu arel, v'afilu Yisrael mumar. The Cuti in this sugya doesn't interest us. Okay, but you can eat a shechita done by a Cuti. You can eat from an arel, an uncircumcised person, and you can eat from a Yisrael mumar, a Jew who doesn't keep halacha. Okay. We don't know which one. That's going to be our whole question. So first we're going to talk about the arel, the uncircumcised person. Hechidami, what's the case? Now if the brothers died, if two brothers died, two sons died, from Brit Milah, we don't do a Brit Milah on the third because we have a chazaka already, and there we go by two is a chazaka because we don't want another child to die. They're exempt from Brit Milah. Well, if you're exempt from Brit Milah, of course you can rely on their shechita. What does that have to do with anything? Yisrael Ma'al Yehu. This is the person who's uncircumcised, not by choice, right? They had no choice. Of course they're a full-fledged Jew. So there would be no reason to put them in a Mishnah and say, we can rely on their shechita. It must be someone who specifically didn't circumcise themselves. You might say it's the parents' fault. No, but when they grew up, it's their responsibility to make sure they get circumcised. And if they don't, then they are transgressing the mitzvah of Brit Milah. Now that's what we call mumar ledavar achel. So we're going to say, this person is a mumar, they didn't do circumcision, it doesn't mean we don't rely on their shechita. And then this line is explaining that mumar ledavar achel lo have mumar lekol Torah kula. Just because we know someone clearly transgresses one thing doesn't mean they transgress other things. That's also logical, right? A lot of people pick and choose, and just because they don't do this doesn't mean they don't do other things. Okay, but now we have to explain what is the next line. Yisrael mumar. So Yisrael mumar, we would have thought that was a Yisrael mumar. So in Maseifa, afili Yisrael mumar. Hai mumar hechidami. What kind of mumar are we talking about here? By the way, it might say by you mashuma, right? That's what we talked about. The censorship changed mashuma to mumar. My version says mumar, so I'm going with that. But yours might say mashumad. Either which way we mean the same thing. Someone who is transgressing sins. So hechidami. What kind of mumar? Mumar ledavar achel. If you're going to say it's a mumar that transgressed some other sin, well, hainu mumar larilu. That was already mentioned in the Tosefta. In the arel case, it can't be that. Elalav, it must be mumar le'oto davar. It must be this ochel nevelo le'teavon. It must be this person who eats non-kosher meat, and yet we could still rely on their meat that they slaughtered, because it's a mumar for that exact issue. Uchid Rava. And that proves Rava. But I told you they're not going to be successful. This is going to get us off on another interesting tangent today. Lo'olam ein alacha mumar le'oto davar lo. Maybe this really doesn't think that if you're a mumar and you eat nevela, in other places, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's in your own house, we cannot rely on your shechita. Okay, according to this, my taima kevan didashba. Here's the opposite logic. Okay, instead of lo shavaginish hatera v'achli surah, kevan didashba ke'atera damile. Since they often eat meat that wasn't slaughtered properly, they view it as if it's permitted. When you get used to doing something forbidden, it ultimately turns in your mind into something that's permitted, because once you've done it so many times, you get used to it. And therefore, they might slaughter this incorrectly and they don't really care because they're immune to it. So what must it be then, this mumar? Well, if it's not mumar ledavar acher and it's not mumar ledavar zeh, what are we left with? Well, we're left with one thing, which is ela mumar la'avodah zarah. Now, avodah zarah is considered like all the other mitzvot. So it's kind of in between. It's not for shechita, because you worship idols. On the other hand, worshiping idols is so serious that you might have thought that it precludes you from being trusted for your shechita, comes this braita to say, the Tosefta, we can rely on you for shechita, even though you're a mumar for avodah zarah, which is considered like all the mitzvot. No, we're going to trust your shechita. How do we know this? Kid Rav Anan, like Rav Anan said. Amar Rav Anan Amar Shmuel, Yisrael mumar l'avodah zarah, mutar lechom shechitato. Okay, a Jew who's a mumar for avodah zarah, he said, okay, he quoted Shmuel as saying, Rav Anan quoted Shmuel, saying you can eat from his shechita. Okay, we don't know why, but we're going to see why right now, and we're going to get to a story from Tanakh. Okay, Gufa. Amar Rav Anan Amar Shmuel, Yisrael mumar l'avodah zarah, mutar lechom shechitato. Shekem matzinu b'Yehoshaphat melech Yehuda shenehenen misudat Achav. What we see is that Yehoshaphat, who was a good king, okay, there were good kings and bad kings, he was a king of the Judean kingdom that ended up marrying, I forget whether it was his son to Achav's daughter or the reverse, but they basically create a marriage between Achav, who was a terrible king, if you remember. He had like tons of Nevi'ei Baal, they were Nevi'im to Avodah Zarah, he worshipped Avodah Zarah, his wife was Yezebel, right, they had terrible things going on in their family. They lied and framed Navot HaYisraeli. Okay, completely untrustworthy person. But they end up marrying their children to each other, and then they go out to war together. Okay, so now, what happens here? So we have this story where Yehoshaphat ate food, meat, particularly at Achav's house. And that's how we're going to prove that obviously someone who is a mumar l'avodah zarah, none other than Achav, one of the most famous mumarim for avodah zarah, who basically is going to now serve meat to Yehoshaphat, and Yehoshaphat, the good king, is going to eat it. So this is going to take us off on a long tangent to try to discuss this situation. So how do we know that he ate it? Shneimar. By the way, okay, well, I'll read this pasuk and then I'll tell you a little bit more of the story. V'yizbach lo Achav sonu bakar larov, v'la'am asher imo, v'yisiteu la'alot aramo gilad. So Achav slaughters all this meat. Okay, obviously not him himself, but his people slaughter all the meat. Lots of meat, larov, v'la'am asher imo, and he gives it to the, right, he does it for Yehoshaphat and the people that were with Yehoshaphat. V'yisiteu, and he seduces him to go to Ramot Gilad, to go fight with him. Okay, what happens, why is this so famous? Because in the end, right, first Yehoshaphat says, I'll go with you, but I want to ask a Navi, and then he brings all these Nevi'ei Sheker, and then he says, is there a real Navi here? And they say, no, Achav says, this one guy, but he hates me. And then he says, bring that guy, because, he always says bad things about me, because obviously Achav was deserving of it. Anyway, the guy comes and he says, listen, the people are going to be like sown without a ro'eh. They're going to be like sheep without a leader, because the leader is going to die, but everyone else is going to be safe. And then Achav says, right, meaning Achav's going to die. And Achav says, you see, I told you he never says anything good about me, right? And in the end, Achav dies. Okay? That's the story. But the whole beginning is that Achav slaughtered all this meat and then seduced Yehoshaphat to go with him. So, seems like he ate meat in Achav's house. And that's the proof. So now they're going to have a whole bunch of things. Are you really sure? Maybe maybe Achav slaughtered all these animals, but maybe Yehoshaphat didn't eat. So they have a great answer. It says he seduced him. How did he seduce him? If not with food. Right? Food is the best way to seduce someone. V'dilma b'dvarim, maybe he seduced him in words. Ein hasata b'dvarim, there's no such thing. People always get pulled to do something, enticed to do something with food. Okay, food is what works, not words. V'lo, wait a minute. How do you know that? Look in the Torah. When the Torah talks about the mesit, the person who seduces someone to go worship idols, ki yisitcha achicha. So they say, right? It says when someone basically pulls his brother to go worship idols, so they say, b'achilav v'shtiya. No, there also, it must be talking about, he didn't say it in the Torah, but obviously, how else are you going to entice someone to do something if not with food? V'haktiv, well now they're going to have a good winter pasuk, which clearly was not with food. V'tisitenu bolav alochinam, this is in Iyov, when the Satan seduces God and gets God to basically come and do all these bad things, take away Iyov's family and everything he has. Okay, and obviously God doesn't eat food. So lemala shane. No, okay, that's God. God is in a different place, but anything on a human level, if someone's going to entice someone else, they're always going to do it with food. It was clear it was with food. Okay, but we're still going to have some more questions. Maybe it was with drink. Okay, food doesn't always mean food. Maybe he was enticed to do it with wine, right? Wine, we know, is a big enticer. Maybe Yehoshaphat didn't eat the meat. Maishna shtia. What do you mean? Drinking would also be a problem from someone who worshipped idols. We learned of Masechet Avodah Zarah all about Yein Nesech, right? Wine that was offered as libation to their gods. So Maishna shtia damrina mumar lavodah zarah lo ave mumar l'chol Torah kula, right? Just because he's a mumar lavodah zarah. Well, look, Yehoshaphat drank his wine, so we're obviously trusted when it comes to the wine. Achila nami mumar lavodah zarah lo ave mumar l'chol Torah kula. So you would say the same thing about the shechita. If you're going to trust for the wine, you're going to trust for the shechita. So if it doesn't matter, ate or drank, either which way, we're going to learn the same halacha. They say, no, it's not the same thing. Okay, now we're going to go back to Avodah Zarah. Okay, remember what we learned there. Hachi hashta, shtia stam yenamhu, v'adayin lo ne'emal stam yenam shel goyim. At that time of Yehoshaphat, the whole Isser of Stam Yenam, that was the Gzeira of the rabbis. The rabbis said, what's forbidden in the Torah? To have wine that was offered as a libation to idols. But not every wine that every non-Jew has, even if they're idol worshippers, wasn't necessarily offered as a libation to their gods. Most of their wine is Stam Yenam. We don't know what happened to it. The rabbis came and said, don't drink any Stam Yenam of non-Jews. But they never said, right, but in the time of Yehoshaphat, that wasn't forbidden. And there was no way to think that Achav's wine was poured as a libation to the idols. So therefore, that's why he was able to drink the wine. And maybe really all he did was drink the wine. But this doesn't teach you anything about shechita. But maybe, right, we can't learn about shechita here. And maybe we didn't rely on his shechita. So we're going to have two resolutions to this. Okay, no, it's not appropriate that the king would come and only drink and not eat. That just wouldn't happen. It's not only wouldn't happen, it would be inappropriate. Ibait ema, or you could say, look at the pasuk. Vayizbach, vayisiteu ktiv, b'me'esito b'zvicha. It says in the pasuk, slaughtered animals, and then he was able to entice him. So it seems like the slaughtering of the animals is what enticed him and not the drinking. So from there we can prove the point, okay, that we were trying to make of Rav Anan, that you can even eat meat that was slaughtered by someone or slaughtered under the supervision of someone who worships idols, as we see with Yehoshaphat and Achav. But now we're going to have a whole slew of questions that we're going to resolve, but we're going to go one by one. V'dilma Ovadia zavach. Now, do you remember? Achav had a very religious servant, okay, who kept in the way of God. His name was Ovadia. Maybe he slaughtered all the meat. So they say, no, wait, did he slaughter all the meat? La rov ktiv, Ovadia lo avasapik. There's no way one person could have slaughtered all that meat for all those people. It said la rov. He slaughtered lots and lots of meat. Vidilma shivat alafim zavach. Wait, but there were 7,000 people at the time of Achav who, in his kingdom, that didn't worship idols, as it says in the following pasuk. Visharti b'Yisrael shivat alafim kol habrachayim v'shelo karu labal. This is God saying, I'm going to leave in the Israelite kingdom 7,000 people who didn't bow down. Maybe those 7,000 people, then we have a lot of people, did all the shechita. So they say, Tamuri having mitamri mizevel. Now, for sure, those 7,000 people were hiding out from Mizevel because she was going to kill them. So there's no way they were there slaughtering in the king's house. V'dilma gavri da Achav havumali. Maybe some of the people in Achav's house were good people, and they were the ones who slaughtered. Lo sakadatach tichtiv. No, it can't be, because it says in Mishlei, Proverbs, Moshel makshiv al dvar sheker, a Moshel, a ruler, who listens to dvar sheker, who's part of falsehood, like, for example, Kerem Navot, that's why I specifically mentioned it, where they framed him. Kol mishartav r'shaim, all of his servants are bad. So there's no way, I mean, obviously he had Ovadia, but we can assume the majority of his servants were bad, so it can't be that we had good people doing the shechita. Still good, they're going to ask questions. Dilma gavre di Yehoshaphat nami lo havamalu. Zavuch gavre da Achav achul gavre di Yehoshaphat. Zavuch Ovadia achal Yehoshaphat. Maybe, now remember, what happened? Achav fed Yehoshaphat and all his people. But maybe his people were bad also, Yehoshaphat's. And maybe we had like this. We said Ovadia couldn't have slaughtered everything, but maybe it was only Yehoshaphat he needed to feed. So maybe Ovadia slaughtered for Yehoshaphat, and the bad slaughterers slaughtered for the bad servants of Yehoshaphat. Say, no, lo sakadata. It doesn't make sense that Yehoshaphat had lots of bad servants based on what we just said. A bad leader has bad servants. Halidvar emet mishartav tzadikim. But someone who's after truth, and that was Yehoshaphat, his servants must have been loyal and good people. So, no, they needed to eat kosher also. V'dilma, Zavua Gavre de Achav, Acha v'Gavre. Zavua Gavre de Yehoshaphat, Acha Gavre v'Acha Yehoshaphat v'Gavre. Maybe they had two different slaughtering stations. One was Yehoshaphat brought his own slaughterers. They slaughtered meat for Yehoshaphat people. And Achav and his people slaughtering for Achav and his people. Maybe that's what happened. So we'll go just one more line here. Lo hava maflig nafshe minei. There's no way Yehoshaphat was going to separate himself from Achav. The whole thing was this union, right? First of all, it was the union of their children. Then it was the union, right? They ate together to then go together to war. He had complete trust in Achav, and they were going together on everything. There's no way they had a whole separate, I'm going to eat my food, you're going to eat your food. And therefore, we're back to saying, we can prove from here, Rav Anan's statement in the name of Shmuel, that someone who's a mumar for Avodah Zarah, you can actually eat their shechita. You can trust their shechita. So we get to this crazy situation, right? We seem to be relying, okay, if we go back and review. So first of all, we had this machloket Abaye and Rava and how they got it from the braita, but where the Jew has to come in and go out, or it's enough to go in and out, or the Jew has to be there the whole time. Where they got it from the braita, from that we got off on this tangent about the birds, and why the birds can we trust if we eat one, that we can eat the rest. And then from there we got into this issue of if the Cutim were muchzakim, even if it's not written in the Torah, we can trust them, although that we saw in the end was a Tannaitic debate. From them we got to the statement of Rava, that even if they're mumar for otodaval, for shechita specifically, we trust their shechita, because it's just as easy for them to do heter than it is isura, and therefore they're going to do the heter. We prove that. Then we tried to prove from another source. We said we can't prove that, because that source really seems to be proving what Rav Anan said, who disagrees with Rava, that mumar lo otodavar won't work. Someone who eats nevela, you can't trust their shechita. But someone who worships idols, you actually can't trust their shechita. And where do we learn that? From Yehoshaphat and Achav. That's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day. There's a lot of food for thought about how we know whether we can trust people or not. It's a very, very interesting sugya. And again, what goes on in people's minds? What are they thinking? If you have two options, which one are you going to take? You're going to do bad, you're going to do good, right? There's a lot of interesting things to think about from this stuff.